Hey, welcome into Strictly Speaking here on True Blue. It's good to have you. Today, we're going to talk about a controversial subject that has been debated for many, many years among parents' rights groups, politicians, physicians, children's rights advocates, medical organizations, but one that really took off in late 2020. Childhood vaccines, because of course it was in late 2020 that the emergency use authorization of the mRNA COVID vaccines was approved by the FDA. And in the 4 years since then, advocates of the shots have been pushing for them to be added to the already overwhelming schedule of vaccinations most children are required to have to even attend school. So today we're going to speak with one of the experts that co-wrote a book on this subject. They collaborated and wrote Unavoidably Unsafe: Childhood Vaccines Reconsidered. The lead author is Dr. Edward Geehr, graduate of Yale University with honors, Duke University Medical School, completed a residency and research fellowship in emergency medicine at UCLA, became board certified in that specialty, served as an associate clinical professor of medicine and surgery at the University of California, San Francisco, chief of emergency services at San Francisco General Hospital, and medical director for the city's EMS system as well. He maintains a private medical practice. So, are your kids getting all of the vaccinations that are required? And should they be? We're going to discuss it today right here on Strictly Speaking. Dr. Geehr, welcome to Strictly Speaking. Good to have you. How are you?
Thanks, Bob. Good to be here. I'm just fine, thanks.
So, I need to start with that title because I found something when I was researching your book and looking up a little bit about what what went into this thing. I found an article that I'll ask you about in a moment. Tell me about unavoidably unsafe. What do those words mean?
Those words came into existence along with the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act in 1986, which was really the point of leverage where vaccines in childhood exploded. But in describing the vaccines, they had to acknowledge that there was something fundamentally unsafe about them, and so it was unavoidably unsafe. But on balance, it was felt it was better for the public health to administer vaccines. The Supreme Court reviewed that decision, that law in 1986 in the 90s, and determined that the law was constitutional, and again embraced the term unavoidably unsafe. What we wanted to do was explore, were they unavoidably unsafe, and how were they unsafe, and how relevant is that to today's children?
Okay. I kind of got the feeling that's what it was about. And one of the first responses that I got, or not responses, but results in my search, came from USA Today addressing that very topic of the Supreme Court. Dylan, throw that up there now, if you would, please. This was, as you can see, from last year, July of last year. No, they say, the Supreme Court did not declare vaccines unavoidably unsafe. And if you scroll that just a little bit, Dylan, you see what they say there in the lead. July 10th Instagram post shows a syringe. If vaccines are safe, how is it the Supreme Court declared them unavoidably unsafe? Post was liked so many times, they rated it as false, saying the Supreme Court did, as you said, Dr. Geehr, reference unavoidably unsafe a few times, but it wasn't their determination about vaccines in a general sense. How do you view that, and what's your response to that?
Well, the fact is they adopted that term. That is part of their ruling in their Supreme Court decision, which is Brusewitz versus Wyeth. And no, they're not. They're not taking a medical position. They're simply making a determination whether or not that law was constitutional. And so their ruling was that it was constitutional. Interesting. Sonia Sotomayor wrote the dissenting opinion on that, and her concern was, as is mine, as should be everyone's today, is that it absolved all of the companies of liability from the products they were producing. And this might lead to a lack of attention to safety as well as effectiveness in the vaccine manufacturers. That was her dissenting opinion. That should be the dissenting opinion today. And that's the basis of my recommendation that that law be repealed.
Yeah, just described in a nutshell, the feeling that a lot of people have about the COVID vaccines. And now we're gonna talk about a lot more than just COVID vaccines, but literally, that was, in a nutshell, the problem here. They rushed that thing through, in just what, 9 months or whatever it was, instead of several years to see what the long-term ramifications and side effects and so forth would be. And they had no fear of it whatsoever because they were shielded from any liability, talking about the pharmaceutical companies, right?
That's correct. They don't have liability. And in fact, they have an added layer of indemnification because the it was issued under something called the emergency use authorization. It wasn't even under the normal licensing procedure, which is known as the BLA or biologic license application. It was issued under the PrEP Act emergency use authorization, which is yet another layer of insulation of the manufacturing companies from liability. And in fact, if you have a complaint about the vaccines, you want to launch a lawsuit, you're suing the federal government, the Department of Justice. You're not suing the vaccine companies if you've got a problem.
So really, they have no fear of any kind of liability, accountability. If this thing goes sideways, and 10 million people die from these shots, provable and verifiable, they just still collect the money, and there's no concern whatsoever.
There's an added issue here, which is of enormous concern. This is based on a ruling that just occurred in North Carolina at the state level, which was a middle school child was forced to get the vaccine. His parents and the child said they don't want it. He went in for a physical and they gave it to him anyway. This was a pre sports physical, apparently. The family sued. The court found that under the PrEP Act, there can be no there is no liability, not only for the people, the manufacturers, but for the people who administer the drug or even the institution in which the drug was provided, the vaccine was given. So, in fact, you can compel a child to get the vaccine, and there's no recourse under the current law, the PrEP Act.
Even for the administration or outfit or organization that requires this. So if there's a vaccine injury and you didn't want the vaccine, but they made you take it to come to school, to play sports, or whatever it is, you get injured, you can't go after the school or organization, you can't go after the FDA, you can't go after the government, you can't go after the pharmaceutical companies who made it. Nobody.
That is specifically for anything that's released under an EUA. And in this case, it was related to the COVID-19 vaccine in this child. It does not apply to other FDA approved vaccines. You cannot compel their use. Although, as we can discuss, the states, by virtue of the school requirements for vaccination, are effectively compelling the use of the vaccines.
Yeah, and we do need to talk about that. That's a big part of your book, I know, and a lot of the
Yeah.
conversation. But just sticking on the mRNA and that part of it, I spoke with Dr. Malone last year on this show, who, of course, is one of the patent holders of the original RNA technology, and he talked about that while it was brought to the market and approved in that 9 month period, that Operation Warp Speed period, it didn't go from genesis to rollout in those 9 months. That they had been working on it. He himself, Dr. Malone, and others had been working on this for a very, very long time, and it almost appeared that they were just waiting for the right event to happen so that they could say, "Boom, let's use the mRNA," and that's what became Operation Warp Speed. Is that your understanding as well?
Yeah, the technology goes back a couple of decades, and Malone, along with a number of other scientists, really developed the platform. And the platform was originally intended for genetic changes, that is, to treat cancer. It was never intended to render it as a vaccine. And he was most vocal in coming out early on saying this should never have been made into a vaccine because of some of the real difficulties in the mRNA product, which we can get into, but in and of itself is a dangerous product.
So to me, it sounds, and I agree with that, by the way. And it was weird when I talked to Dr. Malone. You probably know the story right now. He got the first two shots. He got the first one and then a booster. And then he said it nearly killed him. He said he was never going to take another one because he knows literally he will die. And that's an astounding thing from a man who is, one of the pioneers of the technology. But to the EUA, the emergency use authorization, that to me just seems like, I guess I ask myself, why does that exist? I can understand if there is a massive plague, and I'm talking about like the Black Plague, where people are dying from it, directly and quickly, and so on and so forth. Maybe you require something under an EUA.
Mhm.
Other than that, how is it not brought to market and made available, but rather than be required, be offered? Look, this is unproven. We don't know what the short term effects are going to be. We certainly don't know what the long term effects are going to be. But if you're worried, go ahead and know that this is there for you. How can they make something available? Not available. Rather, how can they make something required under an EUA?
It's part of it's the law. It's based on the PrEP Act, which was passed in 2005, actually under the Bush administration. And it gave the government enormous powers. It gave specifically designated the head of Health and Human Services, who in this case is Xavier Becerra, who is not even an MD. He's an attorney. He was the Attorney General of California, and then a senator, and then was appointed to this HHS position. It's under his signature that he can mandate the use of vaccines and indemnify everyone associated with the administration of the vaccines. By the way, they've just done this again. They've done it with the Mpox, the old monkeypox. There's a vaccine that's meant um, uh, for that's been treating monkeypox in Africa, that they now have authorized for use in the US under an EUA. So they're trying to create another, in my opinion, another pandemic based on Mpox, which is a very restrictive disease to certain populations, and is not one of these respiratory transmission diseases as was the COVID. And so it's astonishing. They're digging deep down into their pile to find more and more reasons to compel the use of vaccines. And it's just, I don't see it. I don't see it stopping. In fact, the WHO is reauthorizing today extension of their emergency declaration for monkeypox worldwide. This is giving greater impetus, and yet it's still pretty much a disease of Central Africa. There's one case that popped up in Sweden, and on that basis, they're declaring this a worldwide pandemic.
So monkeypox or mpox is not transmitted. It's not respiratory. How is it transmitted?
It's skin. It's typically sexual contact. It's been classically among the gay community, but it can be transmitted by close contact with infected individuals. But it's not transmitted through the environment. However, there is a new clade that is a new strain that's emerged. And interestingly, this is a clade that may have been developed in the lab because there were research dollars that went to make the existing monkeypox more infectious. That's the clade that now has emerged in Sweden, and that's the basis for the WHO declaration. They seem to know something that we don't, or they're not telling us. And that could well be that there's some intentional spread of this in order to create another pandemic. The fact that this vaccine, which typically is for smallpox, has been declared an EUA for monkeypox makes me very suspicious of the motives of HHS in making that declaration.
Two times you said planning another pandemic. I don't disagree with you, by the way, but my opinion doesn't matter. You're the expert here. Tell me why you say you think they're planning another pandemic.
Well, just as there was a planning process, Event 201, prior to the breakout of COVID 19, most people don't know this, but this was held at Johns Hopkins. It was a group of experts got together and they predicted the breakout of a novel coronavirus infection that would spread globally. And they talked about the laws and production processes and all of the things that were going to be necessary in order to protect, quotes, the public from this. There was another planning event last year on monkeypox that declared that it would be released, it would become a pandemic this summer. This summer was the outbreak of the monkeypox breakout in the Congo. So it's not. I'm not saying it's planned. I'm saying that others have actually had planning processes of World Health experts who have predicted that these things are going to happen. I take them very seriously now when they tell me something like this is going to break out because they know a lot more than we do.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that. I don't know what your politics are, and I don't care, but I find it curious. And a lot of people are seeing the fact that it happened in spring of 2020, an election year, then we're pretty much clean. And suddenly, here in the summer of 2024, here comes monkeypox, another pandemic, another EUA being granted, a ton of money being given to the same pharmaceutical companies that gave us mRNA vaccines for COVID or shots for COVID are the ones who are putting this together now. And I can't help but wonder, is this being timed to have an impact on a presidential election?
The fact that the WHO just came out with yet another extension of their original emergency declaration, which, by the way, had expired today, that they renewed it again, tells me that they've not given up on this strategy of manipulating elections. Keep in mind, I believe that the monkeypox thing reemerged because the bird flu pandemic never really materialized. Remember, that was the thing everybody was worried about early this summer and late spring. Well, it really never went anywhere. A few people got conjunctivitis, and that was the extent of it. Now, they did kill off a lot of birds and a lot of cattle, but in fact, it wasn't really easily transmitting to humans, and humans weren't getting seriously ill. Next fall in line came monkeypox, or now mpox, because it's politically incorrect to say monkeypox for some reason. So now mpox is emerging. So it's like there's a desperate search on for disease X, the thing that they can do emergency declarations around.
I saw a story just yesterday, 31 or 36, I can't remember now, but this, I think it's the CDC that said extremely high COVID cases have been now been found in 31 or 36 states. And when they say extremely high, it means comparative to the course of the last 12 months and so forth. It's really spiking now as we head into the fall and the winter and flu season and so on and so forth. If they really want to go with another pandemic, why not just revive COVID? Because it sounds like that's already, I don't know. Maybe it's a double header. Maybe we're going to do mpox, and by the way, COVID
Yeah,
is still raging as well.
yeah. I think that COVID is the old standard. The issue with COVID is that as it circulates and it migrates and it mutates as a respiratory virus, it does get weaker. It's endemic now. It will forever, for the rest of our lives, be in circulation out there as more like a common cold. But since they use PCR testing, you can basically make anything. You can make an old shoe test positive for coronavirus. And so they will find lots of cases, but it is getting weaker and weaker. The other thing to keep in mind that of all the millions of people who were vaccinated, this really does permanently impair the immune capability of recognizing and dealing with new coronavirus mutations. And so people who are immunized are at much greater risk of reinfection. This has been proven in several studies now, where in fact, the more vaccinations you got, the more likely you are to catch a mutation of the coronavirus. And that's, I believe, that's exactly what we're seeing now.
Yeah, it was only a month or so, a month and a half ago or so, that the president of the United States, who I think has had 6 shots or something like that, at least that's what they tell us, had to go into quarantine or self isolation or whatever because he got it again. So I get that. Okay, those who condemn and criticize people for condemning and criticizing the COVID shots, they call us vaccine deniers or vaccine opponents or what have you. So let's get into the meat of your book now. Unavoidably Unsafe, the childhood vaccines reconsidered, because they say if you don't believe in the COVID shot, then you probably don't believe in the polio vaccine. You probably don't believe in MMR vaccines and so on and so forth. And these things are all extraordinarily important. So let me ask you about that part first. The label of being an anti-vaxxer, if you don't want an mRNA shot, that means you're against all of these childhood vaccines. And then I want to talk about the proliferation and why these things have grown through the years. We didn't have 70 shots for kids, 50 years ago, but we do now. So first, the labeling that if you don't believe in these vaccines, you don't believe in vaccines at all, makes you a vaccine denier.
Well, to be clear, neither Dr. Barkey, my co-author, or I are anti-vaxxers. We have ourselves been vaccinated. Our children have been vaccinated. My grandkids have gotten vaccinations, but they do so now on a much more selective basis, really on a risk-benefit basis. So what we're advocating in the book is really that there are risks and benefits of the vaccines. We believe the risks of the vaccines have been underestimated because of the nature of the approval process for vaccines, which is quite different than for drugs. And that when we went back and looked at all of the studies that support the use of the individual vaccines, we found enormous gaps in knowledge about the safety. For example, the hepatitis B vaccine, which is given on day one, right after birth, the hepatitis B vaccine is given. It's recommended, it's on the schedule. Um, that had 3 days of safety testing. That was it. There was no control group. They simply watched the kids for 3 days. And after 3 days, they said the kids were doing okay. That was that. And that is more the case than not throughout the rest of the vaccines. The childhood vaccines have been studied, that is for children under 6 and under, has been for 6 months. Most of them have only been studied for between 30 and 45 days. And often there's no control group, or there's no true placebo control against which to measure the safety of and effectiveness of the vaccines.
When did the Hep B vax become mandatory the day of birth?
That was relatively recently, but that was since the 1986 Act. That was the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act. And that caused the explosion of vaccines to occur. Because remember, that was the law that indemnified the vaccine companies from liability. So in fact, and now you also had the CDC is funded to promote vaccines, and not only that, pay for vaccines for the children that can't afford it. So 50% of the vaccines given to children in the country are paid for by the federal government. And the rest through private insurance and elsewise. If there's any bad outcome, you can't sue the vaccine company. You have to sue the federal government. You go into a special category, a special court in which to file that claim. And so it was since that act that hepatitis B and a number of other vaccines were introduced. Day one, though, is a relatively recent experience. And now they've actually added this year yet another vaccine to be given day one, which is the RSV vaccine. It's actually not even a vaccine, it's a monoclonal antibody. It's actually a therapy. Never before has a therapy been added to the vaccine list. And now millions of children will be getting a therapy. You talk about giving too much antibiotics and they can create resistant strains. Well, that's precisely what's going to be happening with the RSV vaccine given day one. And the French have already proven that the French were the first to adopt this, that the kids were getting vaccinated their first day. Out of the first 200,000, several died from RSV. It seemed to actually sensitize the children to the RSV as opposed to protect them. This is not a good idea, and yet this is now on the vaccine schedule.
Has anyone brought that up to the CDC? Who makes these mandatory, the schedule that we're talking about here? Is it CDC or is it?
Yeah, it's this. First of all, the FDA authorizes the vaccines,
Right.
and then the CDC decides whether or not to put them on the schedule. There is enormous pressure, obviously, from the vaccine manufacturers to get on the schedule, because once you're on the schedule, you tend not to come off. And it's like
Yeah.
an annuity. It's at least $1 billion a year to get a vaccine on the schedule. And some are a lot more than that. And so there is enormous pressure on the CDC to bring them. I'll also add that in the first 12 months of life, a child will get 28 vaccines. When I was a kid, we got 5. That's the alarm. That set the alarm off for me and Dr. Barkey when we started looking at this. In addition to the rush to get COVID vaccine to the market, these were the kinds of things that drove us to write this book.
So, Dr. Geehr, the French children's deaths didn't open the eyes of any American doctors, anybody in the CDC, and saying, "Whoa, let's slam the brakes on the RSV day one thing." Kids are dying over there with that very same approach.
Yeah, it's really fallen on deaf ears, and that's part of the approval process. Once something makes it on the schedule, it's rare to go back and relook at this. Now, that has happened in the past. For example, the original DPT vaccine, which is now the DTaP vaccine, was a particularly dangerous vaccine. That actually led to the law, the 1986 NCVIA Act, where they indemnified the manufacturers because so many kids were damaged and injured by the DPT vaccine that the companies turned to the Congress and said, listen, you need to protect us or we can't make vaccines anymore. That's when they got indemnification, but they did change the formulation of that particular vaccine to the current one that's being used. However, as we point out in our book, there are still considerable problems with that vaccine. But it's not nearly as dangerous as the original DTP vaccine.
Going
DPT
back
vaccine.
going back to the RSV, how many days did they study for side effects of them? You said 3 days for Hep, right? Hep B.
3 days for Hep.
What about
Yes. So
RSV?
that was a multi-month study, and it really was uh, because there were so few kids who are getting RSV, although it's a vulnerable age range. Most kids come out and have immunity from their mothers. So the mothers pass on immunity to their babies, both through placentally as well as through breast milk. And so this is not, in my opinion, unless it's a premature child or a child born with some other health condition like cystic fibrosis or some immune disorder. These are kids that are immunized effectively by their mothers and protected by their mothers until they develop their own immune systems. That typically takes about 12 months in a child. And unfortunately, during those 12 months, we're bombarding them with a lot of these vaccines, which contain some very nasty chemicals. Prominent among them is aluminum. And you recall that in the old days, it was mercury that was the thing. Thimerosal was the bane, although they said that never caused autism. Well, they substituted aluminum for thimerosal in the vaccines. And the reason they had to do that is if you just gave the vaccines without something like aluminum, the vaccines won't take. They won't register. The immune system is not able to adapt to respond to a stimulant like that. It takes a natural infection for a child to develop a normal immune response. Aluminum, and before that, mercury was given in order to boost the immune response. It jacks it up unnaturally. And unfortunately, there's so much aluminum now given in that first year, it's highly toxic. And that's why we believe that aluminum is at the core of some of these claims of potential links between vaccines and autism.
Yeah, we need to get into the autism conversation. I'm curious with everything I'm hearing you say. Now, I think you said a few moments ago, both you and Dr. Barkey, your kids were all vaccinated with the full schedule, grandchildren, and so on and so forth. Um, did you come to this discovery of so much the research that you did in this book after the fact with those kids and
Yes,
grand?
very much. And in fact, my own grandchildren are now, they're modifying their vaccine schedule based on the book, based on the
Reward.
findings of the book.
Okay,
Absolutely. So for example, hepatitis B is a disease of, it's a sexually transmitted disease, or it's a disease of IV drug users. If the mother's not hepatitis positive, which is tested during pregnancy, there's absolutely no reason whatsoever the child should get a hepatitis B vaccine. And yet, day one, they're not only getting hepatitis and the RSV vaccine, the hepatitis vaccine contains a huge slug of aluminum, which is hitting this poor brain of these developing children at the most vulnerable stage possible. And therefore, my grandchildren's schedules have been modified based on that kind of input.
got it. Okay. Sticking with Hep B then for just a second, since they only monitor for 3 days, is there any data that show after 3 days, that 3 months, 3 years, or whatever down the line, children who took those vaccines are starting to see the side effects and the reactions that we didn't monitor, that we didn't notice in the 3 days of monitoring that we gave? Any data
Well,
on that?
yeah, well, that's the problem. The problem is that the FDA has not financed studies to look at things like that longitudinally. You
Of
do a
course.
3 day study, you get a 3 days of worth of results. And so only by implication can you look at the relationship of multiple vaccines with autism. And when we get into that discussion, I can describe that a little bit more. But now, right now, so we're looking at more at aggregate data, for example, the numbers of vaccines and the incidence of autism, but tying it into any one particular vaccine. There is no research, by the way, in the combination of vaccines. You throw a bunch of these vaccines together. For example, at 12 months, you can get as many as 9 or 10 vaccines on one day. All of them, many of them containing aluminum, as well as many other products, formaldehyde, phenol, a bunch of other toxic ingredients. Um, and there's no studies whatsoever on the combination vaccines and what the health effects are. It's not been looked at all.
I don't understand how that can be. I mean, we're talking about literally our children's lives. And my kids, I've got two children, 21 and 23 now, and so they got them all. What's MMRs? What, measles, mumps, rubella,
Rubella, yes.
and DTaP? And you say there's 28 now, and there were 5 when you were a child. Where, I mean, can you give us some examples? What are some of the other ones that are so important? They're mandatory to allow kids to get into public schools.
Sure. Well, you've now got there are flu vaccines, the COVID vaccines, hepatitis A, the pneumococcal, Haemophilus influenza B. So there's a number of other vaccines that have now been added to the schedule. And by 28, I don't mean there are 28 different vaccines. That is, there are 28 exposures. So, for example, MMR, you're going to get twice during your first year. That's 6. That's 6 vaccines between them because there are 3 times. DTaP is also 3, and you're going to get that 3 or 4 times in your first year. And the polio vaccine, you're going to get a couple of times. So when you add all of those up, you're coming up with 28 separate vaccines. They're not 28 separate shots because you have combination vaccines being given. Well, they give 5 or 6 vaccines in one shot.
Got it, and that's fine. But what led to that massive expanse? I mean, were we seeing back in the days when there were 5, 5 different vaccinations in whatever number of shots that it took? Were we seeing all of these children dying or suffering from terrible fates and so on and so forth, and spreading, their diseases to one another? How did we go from one to another? Is it a simple matter of free market? Uh, you know, Government regulated or unregulated, basically, of these pharmaceutical companies working with the federal government, agencies and so forth, saying we have to have all of these in? Is it just a matter of money? Is that the reason we expanded this?
Sadly, it's that, and the fact that there's no liability among the vaccine manufacturers. So the money is abundant. It is liberally spread around Congress. It's spread to the media. It's spread to medical specialty societies. It's spread to academia. It touches everything, and in my opinion, it pollutes everything. The people who are on these advisory boards, so the FDA has these advisory boards which review each of the vaccines as they're proposed, looks at the studies behind them. There are enormous conflicts of interest among these members. Many of them are advisors to the very companies that are seeking approval. And yet they're not disqualified from rendering an opinion, where in fact they should be disqualified. It's a clear conflict of interest.
Yeah.
Moreover, most people are unaware that the NIH generates 70% of its budget each year from the drug manufacturers. They pay to have their drugs and vaccines reviewed by the FDA and put into an expedited review process. They're willing to pay the millions to make that happen. Moreover, what's even less well known is the fact that a number of NIH administrators and research scientists collect royalties on the drugs and vaccines that they help to develop. So there are since 2001, this will blow your mind. Since 2001, there's been over $700 million in royalty payments to the NIH. 90% of those royalty payments went to Fauci's division, the NIAID. And
Wow.
we can't, by law, know who got those royalty payments. That's in the law. We do not have, Congress cannot access that information. That's hidden information. We don't know who's getting paid and how much. They've tried to FOIA this several times. They will not disclose this information. So there's conflicts every which way you can look at. Most especially, the concern obviously is with the regulatory agencies, which in my opinion have been captured by industry.
There you go. That's what I was asking. And that's infuriating, by the way. So Congress passed a law that says even we can't find out where that money's going.
That's right. That's right.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
So I seem to have lost my train of thought. You got me on the money trail there for a second here with Fauci. That's mind-blowing.
It is. Yeah.
It's infuriating. But so let's move on to the autism. If I think of what I wanted to ask you more
Sure.
about that, but let's talk about this because this is in my introduction. I said this has been debated for years. There are a lot of people, decades really. There are a lot of people who have made the connection and said, so many of these vaccines, maybe it's the aluminum, maybe it's a combination of different things. They're leading to these very, very, this increasing in frequency and number. Oh, I remember the question now. I was going to ask you about the AMA.
Okay.
We talked about NIH. I want to know about the AMA as a body, and then also individual physicians like yourself. Um,
Yeah.
are they opposed to this model that you're talking about right now? Is the AMA with this and saying, nope, we're just going to blindly jam these needles into every thigh and every arm that we can with all of these kids, and just because that's what we're told to do? Does the AMA have a different perspective on this? And are you, as a member of the AMA, whether you're a physician, pediatrician, whatever, are
Mhm.
you allowed to deviate from that, as you say, on a risk reward basis, child by child?
No, unfortunately, the medical specialty society, starting with the AMA, and I'm not a member of the AMA. I haven't been a member for a number of years because
Okay.
when they all of a sudden spun in favor of Obamacare, I thought, okay, it's now a fully captured agency, and it's not working in the interests of physicians and their patients any longer. If you look down, you look at the Pediatric Society, Obstetrics and Gynecology, the College of Obstetrics and Gynecology. All of them have received multi-million-dollar grants from the CDC to promote the vaccines. And
There it
so
is.
it's very, very difficult to find. In fact, none of the regular, the well-known specialty societies are raising any questions whatsoever about vaccination. In fact, what they're doing now is teaching physicians how to override the irrational concerns of patients about the safety of vaccines, how to talk to them, how to effectively induce them to want to get vaccinated. And moreover, and this just happened this past year, the Pediatric Society for the first time has said, if you have patients who are declining vaccines, you can kick them out of your practice. That's not patient abandonment anymore. That's exercising, that's acting in their best interest. How kicking a patient out of your practice encourages them to get vaccines, I have no idea. But that's how much it's degraded from the perspective of the medical specialty societies.
So I'm going to go ahead and assume that people like you and Dr. Markey are almost pariahs in your field, right? Because you're saying things right now, and what you write in Unavoidably Unsafe is it's blowing the lid off of all of that stuff.
Well, we just a few years ago, I think we were fairly novel in our position, but it's more and more being accepted not only by the by the community at large, the parents, but it's also being accepted by the medical community more and more. They're starting to question, and I do think COVID drove a lot of this. They looked at it and said, "This just doesn't make sense. This EUA thing just doesn't make sense." We saw what the studies were. We saw how poorly studied it was. We saw how they broke the control groups early on, so there could be no comparison long term. Um, I think this alerted a lot of physicians, and I think what Dr. Barkey and I are doing is really putting a voice to those concerns and making it accessible to the general public.
Okay, and I'm glad to hear that. So let's go on to the autism issue now, because
Yeah.
again, this has been going on for a very, very long time. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is, of course, running for president in kind of a fringe campaign, but he's been one of the loudest voices. And again, he's called an anti-vaxxer. As you pointed out, though, you and Dr. Markey are not anti-vaxxers. You're not, vaccine deniers or whatever the case might be, but you are practical about it. And there are some things that you think are worth the risk and the
Yes.
reward is enough to put into kids, and some things not. But there are a lot of people say all of these vaccines are contributing to this massive spike in the number of autism cases. Tell me about that research, and then tell me where you fall down on
Sure. Um, the CDC, if you go to the CDC's website on vaccines, they state unequivocally that there is no relationship between vaccines and autism. If you then go, as I did, and looked at all of the studies they cite, they make a very unconvincing case that there is no association. At best, they raise an issue about whether or not it is connected. In fact, I drew some contrary conclusions to the ones that their authors drew in the studies. Since then, there have been 5 other studies that have been published in peer-reviewed journals that look at an association between the numbers of vaccinations and autism. Now, it doesn't prove, again, correlation is not causation, as they say, but there are strong correlations between the numbers of vaccines and the incidence of really what we call autism spectrum disorder. That's a whole continuum from sort of attention deficit through frank autism. There is clearly a correlation between the two. The point we make in the book is, and the fact, as we discussed earlier, there's never been a study of multiple vaccines and tracking those children to see what the results are. All we know on our end is that the studies that have looked at multiple vaccinations show that there is an increasing incidence of autism. And you only have to look at the incidence of autism since the NCVIA Act of 1986, which has gone from 1 in 1,500 to 1 in 36. And in California, it's actually 1 in 22. So it's an astonishing increase in autism. There could be many factors involved, but to say vaccines cannot be one of them, I think is simply disingenuous. So, and I would point out, there's another interesting study that came out a couple of years ago that looked at wealthy whites and Asians in Marin County, California. So back in 2000, wealthy whites and Asians decided to not vaccinate their kids. This was all part of a movement toward whole organic foods and non-GMO and so forth. And so they started questioning the value of vaccines, and they stopped. They really cut back on vaccinating their children. And there were no mandatory laws at the time. It was much easier to exempt yourself going to school from the vaccination process than it is now. In fact, it's virtually impossible in California to get out of the mandates. So in 2000, if you look at then the incidence of autism in Marin County, it actually, for the first time in history, declined. It actually dropped they measured it between 2000 and 2013, coincident with this effort toward whole foods and organic nature of living and fresh air and outdoors, which is all terrific. I think it's great. I'm all in favor of it. But they also dissociated themselves from vaccine. The same thing happened from Monterey County up through San Francisco County, up to Sonoma County. It was wealthy whites and Asians. Unwealthy, so lower class whites, Hispanics, blacks, and others, the autism rates kept climbing because the vaccination rates were climbing in those groups through public health efforts by CDC funding vaccination and so forth. The state really took that on as a role and vaccinated all these kids, made sure they had it before school. But whites were getting out of it and Asians were getting out of it, and it declined. What's interesting is now it's flip-flopped. And now the irony is that the wealthy whites and Asians in Marin County are now insisting on vaccinating their kids with the COVID vaccine, with the flu virus. They're all adopting it again because it seems to be part of a political movement. It's like wearing masks, driving your Tesla around. I mean, it's like a caricature of protection, of belonging to a virtuous community. And what we haven't seen yet, the data is not back out to see whether or not that inflection has reoccurred in the rates of autism. That will be very interesting to see whether or not autism rises again in those affluent communities now that they've re-embraced vaccines.
So in those middle class and more impoverished communities, did they see a shift?
No, they kept climbing. They kept going up. It was only in the wealthy white communities of white and Asian communities that we saw that the rate went down. And this was in several communities, not just Marin, but it was in Monterey County, Sonoma County, and so forth on up the coast, San Francisco County. But it didn't change. It didn't change the inflection point at all for middle class and lower middle class, whites, blacks, Asian. It doesn't matter what ethnic group you belong to.
So how long of a period of time was it that from the time they started to kind of push away the vaccines and to embrace that holistic lifestyle and so forth, holistic healing, and then getting back into COVID? So that would obviously would have been 2021 when the virtue signaling started. Like you said, I'm wearing my mask, I'm getting my shots, and everything else. But so how long a period was that?
Well, this is back in actually in 2000, not 2021. So this was back in 2000 when they were.
2021. I meant 2021. As I meant when, of course, when they started the COVID shots.
Oh, I see. Yes,
Started
yes.
to
So
re-embrace it. So how long was it that they were pushing away from it?
um, they immediately started to re-embrace vaccinations. So what we found is in the wealthy communities that they were re-embracing the vaccinations. It was like a proof of belonging to a group. That it was your bona fides for being part of a liberal group and having the right virtue signal to say your kids are fully vaccinated, your kids are wearing masks. That's why I jokingly make the comment about people driving around in their Teslas with their masks on. I mean, you can always spot, you can bet their kids are fully vaccinated.
Yeah, and you pretty much know who they're voting for too, because you're right. It was a political statement. It was made very
Yes.
clearly, and in that part of the country, and we know what the politics are in San Francisco County, Marin County, and so forth. Anyway, so it's not a big secret. But you said so. It started in 2000. Those when they kind of started to embrace the holistic stuff and push away. So
Mhm.
about 20 years. So you got a 20-year window in which they saw. And I want to know, like, were concrete studies done, peer-reviewed reports in the journals and so forth done about those
Yeah.
rates of decline? And if so, why wouldn't other parts of the country have embraced that? Why wouldn't other medical professionals have said, hey, some really groundbreaking stuff is happening right now? Out in California, they are finding a much, much lower rate of autism as they get away from these vaccines. One would think that 20 years is a pretty doggone good sample size, right?
Well, here's the thing. The study wasn't published until 2020. So this information really wasn't publicly available in a peer-reviewed journal until 2020, when this publication came out that showed this trend had changed. They had been studying it, so the incidence of autism had been studied for decades. However, the change in the rate of autism, the inflection point was really in the year 2000 is where it began to take effect, and they studied it for the purposes of this publication in 2020 from 2000 to 2013. That's why
Okay.
I believe that if they subsequently study it post COVID, I believe they're going to find a reinflection point of rising cases of autism. That would be my theory that needs to be proven. And we don't know. It was the fact that they were exempting themselves from the vaccine schedule that was causing these kids to not get autism. It could have been they were eating blueberries for all we know, or it was the whole foods they were consuming. Um, but in fact, there will be data now post 2021 vaccines. We will get to see this in a few years. But the fact that the study came out in 2020, there really wasn't the impetus. And since 2020, you know what's happened. It's the public health establishment is totally gung ho about vaccines, and it's
Yep.
going to keep adding more to the list. They're working on more right now.
I can't help but feel like I'm putting on the tinfoil hat when I say this. This is going to be a real conspiratorial thing. But if the study that you're talking about, they studied it from 2000 to 2013, and then 2020 is when the results came out. And
Yeah.
it just so happens here comes the lab leak. And again, I don't know how you feel about the origin of it, but I'm sitting here thinking to myself, if they're like, holy crap, it's about to hit the fan, our massive, our monolithic money making, vaccine machine that we all benefit from is going to be really, really questioned now. We better put something out there that's going to make people embrace vaccines again. How about one that we make almost mandatory for everybody because of the outbreak of COVID-19? It's a little bit out there, I guess, but I just wonder if that timing is too coincidental to be coincidental.
Well, it is a little bit coincidental, but I will say that the technology behind the coronavirus modifications started 2 decades ago. This has been in the works for a while. This was developed out of a lab at the University of North Carolina. A guy named Ralph Barrick did this research. It was funded by Fauci's NIAID, and he was really the one who developed the concept of a spike protein that is attracted to human respiratory cells. And it just so happened that they then transferred the development work over to the Wuhan Institute of Virology in Wuhan, China. which is where the actual virus was created, and then, quote, lab leaked or spread through a pangolin in a wet market or something like that. But it got out of that lab either intentionally or unintentionally. But that work began in Ralph Barrick's lab at the University of North Carolina a long time ago. It's been in development. It's very well funded by Fauci.
Yeah, no question about that. Do you have an opinion? It's just an opinion as to
Yeah.
whether it was intentionally leaked or it escaped the lab in Wuhan.
Um, I just find it a remarkable coincidence that there was a planning process, Event 201, which was held at Johns Hopkins a couple of years before the outbreak, where they
Right.
predicted the outbreak, and the outbreak happened exactly as they predicted. Now, maybe it's a coincidence, but I've come to take these planning processes seriously. This Mpox outbreak was predicted last year in a similar planning exercise. So the fact of the matter is, whenever they have these planning exercises now, I watch and I listen and I take them very seriously.
Yeah, I completely concur and understand why. And I'm glad you're sounding the alarm for other people through conversations like this and through your book as well. Um, do you think how did they not do it better? What I mean by that is they came out with, we've got the shot, Operation Warp Speed and everything else. And again, which kind of pollutes and clouds the politics of this a little bit. Republican president
Yeah,
uh, made it happen. And then the Democrat president that followed him made it mandatory for every government worker
yeah,
and so forth, the military and everything else. But their messaging was safe and effective, safe and effective. It's safe. It won't cause you harm. There will be no vaccine injuries, nothing. And it's going to work. It's going to keep you from getting COVID. It's going to keep you from spreading COVID. And of course, it was neither of those things. The VAERS reporting is
yeah.
astronomical. Dr. Peter McCullough told me directly that more people died from the shots than died from the virus. And the reality is, I'm sorry, I'm just hearing some background noise. Doctor Dr. McCullough said more people died from the shots than the virus. So it wasn't safe. It wasn't effective. You could still get it. You can still spread it, and so on and so forth. You would think if this was going to be their moment to break through with the vaccines, that they would have been better at it. How do they sell them now? How do they push the Mpox vaccine when the last one was so decidedly unsafe and not effective?
Well, I really expected them to, the pharmaceutical manufacturers, the CDC and the FDA did not expect this information to come out. In fact, the only thing that came out was the publication in the New England Journal of Medicine, which largely very much misrepresented the safety and effectiveness of the vaccine. You remember the 95% effectiveness?
Mhm.
That was the original wild virus, 95% effectiveness in getting the infection, but they used a statistical technique which augmented that number. When I reran the statistics and did it on what's called an absolute risk basis, it actually decrease your risk of catching the coronavirus by less than 1%. So it went from 95% to less than 1%. I discuss it in my book how we do the calculation. I don't go into all the stats, but I actually point out why we rework the numbers. Keep in mind that it took a lawsuit to prevent FDA from burying this information for 75 years. And it was only through FOIA lawsuits that it was disclosed, this information, which is what's called the post-marketing survey. So even though they were hiding it from the public, internally, the vaccine manufacturers have to track and see the complications of their vaccines. And what they found was, as Peter McCullough points out, is that in the first 90 days alone, there were over 10,000 deaths. There were 2,300 deaths in the first 2 days alone after someone was vaccinated, 1,100 on the day of vaccination. And that probably had to do with an anaphylactic reaction to an ingredient that's in the lipid nanoparticle that carries the mRNA to all of the cells. So in fact, they thought this information wasn't going to come out, and therefore they could get away with this, that the public wouldn't become aware. And keep in mind, all of our efforts to publicize this information, I, as a physician in California, I was censored. My license was threatened for speaking out against this vaccine. So in fact, they did everything they could to bury this. And now it's only coming out if you look at, and it's not coming out in the medical journals that everybody looks to, that are major medical journals. It's coming out through podcasts. It's coming out publications by Peter McCullough and others, by Malone, and these people who are getting an audience who are now bringing this information forward. Wonderful work's been done by the Daily Clout. That's Naomi Wolf at
Yep.
dailyclout.io. She put together a group of 3,000 lawyers, clinicians, and others to look at those documents, those tens of thousands of pages released by the FDA under a FOIA lawsuit, and went through that and found this information about the complications, which were going to be buried for 75 years.
Yeah, Naomi Wolf is amazing. She's done some great work. I had her on this program almost a year ago talking about this as well. So you're in with the right people. Let's, in the few minutes that we have left here, Dr. Geehr, let's go back to the childhood schedule. Let's bring this to every town and every Main Street USA. You got parents who maybe want to do what you're doing. You're talking about with your grandchildren. You want to pick and choose which vaccines they get based on risk reward. Help them. How do they decide? And moreover, how do they convince their physicians, no, I don't want that, I only want this? How do they
Right.
convince school boards, let my kid in, he's got or she's got everything she needs, she doesn't need the rest of that stuff? Because you're doing it. How you doing?
Yeah, right. So it is a risk benefit issue. And so if your child has chronic illness or conditions, diabetes, is an immune compromised position, has been a cancer patient, has cystic fibrosis, a lot of these vaccines may make sense. But for healthy children, what we walk through is each of the vaccines that you would be getting. And we have a simple scoring mechanism, A to F, where we look at a number of dimensions of the vaccine, the safety and effectiveness of the vaccines. And we actually score that, A to F. And so you can look at a glance on a table for each vaccine and see how we rated that vaccine for healthy children. And so you can go in then to your pediatrician and say, listen, Johnny's got the DTaP coming up. This is what I'm reading about it. What do you think of this? And I've got actually one of the last chapters of the book is how to discuss this with a pediatrician. So,
Good.
for example, I say, here are the 5 things you need to talk with your doctor, your pediatrician about. A, is my child especially at risk of this disease? So a kid getting a hepatitis B vaccine, if the mother's never had been a drug user or a sex worker, makes no sense whatsoever. He shouldn't be getting that. So then I say, if they get the disease, are they particularly vulnerable to that disease? So, for example, kids who got measles in the past, we had measles parties when I was a kid.
Mhm.
So, and my children had measles and chickenpox parties, and so they have natural immunity, which is lifelong. These kids now getting the vaccine, it's much better for them to get natural immunity than it is for them to get the vaccine, because the vaccines do wane over time. They may now be getting, what we're finding is with some of these vaccines like varicella, the chickenpox vaccines, they don't last a lifetime. And so now we're seeing kids who got vaccinated are getting shingles later in life because they're getting chickenpox exposure later in life, and they no longer have immunity, which they would have had they had natural immunity. So those 2 questions: how at risk? Will it be severe? Third, is there a treatment? So, for example, pertussis, which is very common, is a bacterial infection. If you catch that early on, there's a very good antibiotic for pertussis.
That's
That's
whooping
whooping cough. Whooping cough, exactly. Same with diphtheria. Diphtheria is extremely rare now, given modern sanitation. But if a child ever did get diphtheria, again, there are perfectly good antibiotic treatments. Tetanus shots. When you get a stab wound or step on a nail in a rusty yard, you go to the urgent care, they give you a tetanus shot. That tetanus shot does not protect you against that infection. If you get infected, they give you a tetanus toxoid, which prevents the neurotoxin that comes out of that bacteria from infecting your nervous system. So in fact, that tetanus shot really doesn't do any good. It might protect you down the line. So point is my child at risk? And then if he gets it, can it be treated? Is there something else that can be treated, either as a virus or a bacterial infection? A fourth is, before my kid gets a shot, can we test for antibodies to see whether or not he's got natural immunity? And so you can do that now. It's most of these varicella, pertussis, all of these things have tests now that you can get. A rubella. Now, rubella vaccine, I do recommend, especially for girls of childbearing years, girls and women of childbearing years, because you do not want to get pertussis when you're pregnant. But pertussis when you're younger can be treated with an antibiotic if you catch it early on, and most kids do just fine with pertussis. The kids who have underlying medical problems may not do as well, and you may want to give them the vaccine. That's my point about risk and benefits. And if you go through each of the chapters, you can find that. The final thing I ask is, the fifth question I say to ask the doctor about is, you're going to give my kid a DPT vaccine. Can you show me excuse me a sec. Can you show me my own alarm? Can you show me on the package insert, can you discuss with me what the safety and effectiveness is per that sheet? Most physicians, I don't know if you've ever seen these things, you unfold them, are about 2 square meters, about 8 font. And but Dr. Barkey and I looked at all of them and researched the basis for all of them. And I can assure you that most physicians have not read those package inserts and are not fully knowledgeable. In fact, what they rely on is something the CDC puts out, which is called the vaccine information sheet. And the vaccine information sheet is a simple summary of what they interpret the insert to say. And as a result, they say they're safe and they're effective.
Well, thank goodness you and Dr. Barkey did the work and read all that for us, because you're right. I mean, even if we ask a physician, we're not going to be able to have access to that or read that. So I don't want to keep you much longer here, but the A through F scoring system, that's in the book?
Yes, it is. So each of the vaccines, we look at a number of dimensions of safety and effectiveness, and we score each of those dimensions, A to F, and then we have an overall grade for each vaccine. So you can look right on the first page of each of the vaccines in the table and see at a glance how we've scored that particular vaccine. If you want to know more about it, you want to read how we came to those conclusions, that's all discussed in the book. You can get into as much detail as you want. And we have the original sources. We have 680 references backing up the statements in the book. We went to the original sources and we document that all in the book.
Well, I love that you put that there, and I love that you put the questions on what to ask your doctors before you get those shots. Does that also is it the same kind of question carry over to your schools? Because the schools are going to say, "Hey, I see you didn't have this one, or this one, or this one." Is it the same presentation you gave to the doctor, and you just have to hope that they'll listen to you?
It's all state by state. It's in our book. You can research the issues about state by state, which states allow personal exemptions. States like New York and California, it's impossible to get exemptions now. A state like Wisconsin, it can be a parent can just sign a form they can print off the internet and send that in with their kid and say, I don't want my kid getting the shots, and they have to accept that in the schools. So it varies widely between states. Each state law is different, and that's discussed in the book.
Dr. Geehr, so much valuable information just in this 1 hour we've had together. People need to read the entire book, Unavoidably Unsafe, Childhood Vaccines Reconsidered, from the original schedule to the COVID shots. People really need to educate themselves. Dr. Geehr, thank you for taking the time. I appreciate it. Thanks for writing the book, and very best of luck to you. Appreciate you.
My pleasure, Bob. Thank you.
You. All right, that's going to do it for Strictly Speaking today. Make sure you share this episode with anybody else. Leave comments underneath the video if you could, but share it with anybody that you think would find value in it. And that, of course, would mean parents who've got kids who are going to have to go through this very, very soon, or maybe expectant parents in particular. Thanks for watching Strictly Speaking. We'll see you next time.